Welcome to our deep dive into the world of Bertrand Russell, a philosophical powerhouse who wrote on everything from math and ethics to...
Yeah,
We're here to uncover the heart of his philosophical journey
right.
and see how his opinions may have shifted across his many works.
It's a fascinating exploration because Russell had such a long and varied career. It's almost like tracing the evolution of his thinking across decades.
Exactly, and we've got a stack of his writings here to help us do just that. Starting with his early work, an essay on the foundations of geometry, published way back in 1897. Now, I have to admit, when I saw geometry, I thought, uh-oh, this is going to be dense.
Yeah.
But even I found his exploration of non-Euclidean geometries really intriguing.
It's not just about shapes and angles, though. The fascinating thing here is how Russell uses these alternative geometries to challenge our basic assumptions about space itself. For centuries, Euclidean geometry, the kind we learn in school, was considered the only true way to understand space. But Russell was delving into these new geometries, ones that propose completely different ways of thinking about it.
So was he saying Euclidean geometry was wrong?
Not necessarily. He was more interested in the implications of these different systems. He argued that projective geometry, which deals with the relationships between points and lines, was actually more fundamental than metrical geometry, the kind that deals with measurements and distances. But he also recognized that you couldn't simply discard metrical geometry altogether.
Okay, now I'm really starting to get lost in the weeds here.
Think of it this way. Imagine you're looking at a shadow of a circle. In projective geometry, it doesn't matter if that shadow is stretched or distorted. It's still fundamentally a circle because of the relationships between its points and lines. But in metrical geometry, those distortions matter because we're concerned with the actual measurements.
Ah, that makes more sense.
Yeah.
So he was basically saying there are different levels of understanding geometry, each with its own set of rules and implications.
Exactly. And that's where his concept of a manifold comes in. Imagine a surface like a sphere, where the position of points is defined only by their relationship to each other, not by any external coordinates. Russell argued that space itself might be like a manifold, where our usual notions of measurement don't necessarily apply.
That's mind-bending.
Yeah.
So his early work was all about pushing the boundaries of how we understand space itself.
It was, and you can see that same kind of rigorous analytical thinking in his later work on knowledge and experience.
Okay, let's jump into that. What were some of his key ideas there?
Well, in works like Mysticism and Logic and the Analysis of Mind, he starts to grapple with the question of what we can truly know and how we know it. He makes a crucial distinction between knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description.
Now, I remember those terms being thrown around in my philosophy classes,
Yeah.
but honestly, they always kind of went over my head.
Don't worry. It's a concept that takes a bit of unpacking. Think about the difference between knowing what a pineapple tastes like and knowing the chemical composition of a pineapple. Tasting it gives you direct, immediate knowledge by acquaintance. You experience the flavor firsthand.
Right.
Reading about its chemical makeup gives you indirect knowledge by description. You're relying on someone else's observations and analysis.
Okay, I see the difference now. It's like knowing a person versus reading their biography. You get a much deeper understanding through direct interaction.
Exactly. And this distinction becomes really important when Russell starts exploring the nature of our perceptions and the relationship between our minds and the external world.
Yeah.
He dives into this concept of sense data, which are the raw materials of our experience, the basic building blocks of our perceptions.
So not just pineapple flavor, but all the colors, sounds, smells, and textures we encounter.
Precisely. Russell argued that our minds don't just passively reflect the world as it is, but actively construct our perceptions from these basic sense data. He's challenging the idea that our minds are like mirrors perfectly reflecting reality.
So we're not just seeing the world, we're interpreting it, shaping it with our own minds.
And that's where things start to get really interesting. Because if our perceptions are constructed, how much of what we think we know is actually shaped by our own internal processes, our memories, our beliefs, our expectations, all of those, yeah. And that leads right into one of Russell's most intriguing arguments. He took on the behaviorists, who were all the rage back then. They believed that all human behavior could be explained as simply responses to external stimuli.
So like Pavlov's dogs, ring a bell, they salivate.
Exactly. But Russell argued that this view was way too simplistic. He pointed out that even seemingly straightforward behaviors involve complex mental processes.
Like what? Give me an example.
He uses the example of a child learning to say the word motor
Okay.
But on the surface, it seems like a basic stimulus response situation, right? The child sees a car and someone says motor.
Right.
But Russell points out that there's so much more going on in that child's mind. They're connecting the word to the object. They're grasping the concept of a motor car, forming the intention to communicate. It's not just a mindless reaction.
It's like they're building a whole mental model of the world, not just responding to isolated stimuli.
Exactly. And this emphasis on the complexity of human thought and experience ties directly into his social and political philosophy.
Ah, so his deep dive into individual minds led him to examine the structures of society as a whole. Makes sense. So where do we start with that?
Well, one of the central themes in Russell's social and political writings is his unwavering belief in the importance of individual liberty. He considered it a fundamental human right, the cornerstone of any just society.
So is he talking about absolute freedom, like doing whatever you want with no consequences?
Not quite. He was very aware of the tension between individual liberty and social order. In his book Political Ideals, he argues that the state has a crucial role to play in protecting individual freedoms and ensuring a fair distribution of resources. But he was also very wary of the state's potential for overreach and the dangers of unchecked power.
Sounds like he's walking a tightrope here. Advocating for freedom, but also recognizing the need for limits.
That's where the nuance of his thinking comes in. He wasn't afraid to grapple with complex, even contradictory ideas. For him, it was all about finding that balance point between individual autonomy and the common good.
So where did capitalism fit into all of this?
Russell was a pretty sharp critic of capitalism, especially as it was practiced in his time. He saw it as a system that concentrated wealth and power in the hands of a few, while leaving many struggling for basic necessities. He felt capitalism promoted greed and competition, which he believed hindered social progress and individual fulfillment.
He even went so far as to call capitalism and the wage system twin monsters eating up the life of the world. Talk about strong words.
He wasn't pulling any punches. He was passionate about exploring alternative economic systems, systems that prioritize social justice and well-being. In Proposed Roads to Freedom, he dives into various models from socialism to anarchism.
So he wasn't just complaining about the problems, he was actively searching for solutions.
Exactly. He advocated for a system that would provide a basic level of economic security for everyone, regardless of whether they worked or not. He believed this would free people from the constant struggle for survival and allow them to pursue more fulfilling lives.
It's interesting how this ties back to his ideas about individual liberty. He's essentially arguing that true freedom requires a certain level of economic security.
Right. He saw economic inequality as a major obstacle to genuine individual liberty. He believed that people trapped in poverty and insecurity couldn't truly exercise their freedom of choice.
This brings us to another key aspect of Russell's philosophy, his pacifism. It seems to be deeply intertwined with his critiques of the state and his vision for a more just world.
Absolutely. Russell's pacifism was deeply personal and profoundly shaped by his experiences during World War I. He saw firsthand the horrors of war, the devastation it wrought on individuals and society as a whole. He became convinced that war was never the answer, that it always caused more harm than good.
But was he a complete pacifist, like never advocating for any use of force?
He did grapple with that question. He recognized that sometimes force might be necessary, particularly in cases of self-defense or in response to tyrannical regimes.
So again, we see that tension between idealism and realism.
Exactly. He was wrestling with the difficult question of how to reconcile his pacifist beliefs with the harsh realities of a world where violence and aggression were all too common.
He wasn't afraid to confront those tough questions.
Not at all. It's what makes his work so compelling and thought-provoking even today. He never shied away from those uncomfortable truths about human nature and the challenges of building a better world.
So we've explored quite a bit here. We've journeyed through Russell's fascinating ideas on geometry, the nature of knowledge, and his critiques of societal structures. Where do we go from here? What are some key takeaways from this deep dive into Russell's philosophical world?
I think what strikes me most is the sheer breadth and depth of Russell's intellectual curiosity. He wasn't content to stay within the confines of any one discipline. He saw connections between seemingly disparate fields, and he brought the same rigor and analytical approach to every subject he tackled.
He was a master of connecting the dots. Whether analyzing mathematical concepts or dissecting social injustices, there's this underlying consistency in his thinking.
And yet, he wasn't afraid to change his mind. He acknowledged that our understanding evolves over time, and he was willing to revise his own views in light of new information or experiences.
There's a real intellectual humility there, a willingness to admit he might be wrong, which is a quality we could all use a bit more of these days. It's what makes his work so relevant and important, even now.
Absolutely. He reminds us that critical thinking, open-mindedness, and a commitment to truth are essential qualities for navigating the complexities of our world.
It's safe to say that Bertrand Russell was more than just a brilliant philosopher. He was a public intellectual, a social critic, a voice for peace and reason in a world often driven by passion and conflict. His legacy is one of intellectual honesty, relentless questioning, and a deep commitment to making the world a better place. And his work continues to challenge us, to think deeply, to question assumptions, and to strive for a world where individual liberty and social justice can coexist.
And he left us with plenty to ponder. We haven't even touched on his work on education ethics or religion.
There are entire deep dives waiting to be had on each of those topics. But before we wrap up, I think it'd be great to leave our listeners with one of Russell's particularly thought-provoking ideas, something to mull over as they continue their own explorations.
I like that, leaving them with a little something to chew on. It's like a philosophical fortune cookie.
Okay, hit me with it. What's the fortune?
Russell argued that one of the great dangers of modern society is the increasing tendency toward herd mentality, the pressure to conform to the dominant beliefs and values of the group.
Ooh, that's a good one. It's like we all get swept up in the currents of popular opinion, and it becomes harder and harder to think for ourselves.
Exactly. Russell believed that this kind of uncritical conformity stifled individual creativity, stifled dissent, and ultimately hindered social progress.
So what's the antidote? How do we avoid getting caught in the herd?
Russell championed the importance of cultivating what he called the scientific spirit, a mindset characterized by skepticism, curiosity, and a willingness to challenge received wisdom.
So it's about constantly questioning, digging deeper, and never blindly accepting things at face value.
Precisely. Russell believed that this scientific spirit wasn't just essential for scientists, but for everyone, in every aspect of life.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the mind of Bertrand Russell, I think we can leave our listeners with this challenge: to cultivate that scientific spirit in themselves, to think critically, to question fearlessly, and to never stop searching for truth, even if it means standing apart from the herd.
It's a challenge that's as relevant today as it was in Russell's time.
Well, folks, that's it for our deep dive into the world of Bertrand Russell. We hope you've enjoyed this journey through his complex and fascinating ideas. And remember, the quest for knowledge is never truly finished. There's always more to explore, more to learn, and more to discover. So keep those minds open and those questions coming. Until next time, happy thinking.